Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to Sandy Rosenthal. Sandy is an American civic activist and founder of levees.org, an organization that she created in October 2005 to educate the American public about the cause of the levee failures and catastrophic flooding in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was the third deadliest hurricane in the history of the United States, with a death toll of more than 1,800 people, and 500,000 families were affected. Sandy's the author of 7-time award-winning book, Words Whispered in Water: Why the Levees Broke in Hurricane Katrina. Founder of levees.org and the podcast host of Beat the Big Guys, Sandy has received many awards for her work in bringing attention to the condition of levees. So welcome, Sandy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Sandy, you lived in New Orleans during Katrina, and your book, Words Whispered in Water, tells us about it. But I would suggest that everybody get a copy of the book and read it for yourselves. Sandy, give us some of your own recollections as you heard about the storm that was brewing that turned out to be Katrina.
Well, that's actually a very interesting story. And because of it, I was in a very unusual position after the flooding. So I'm married to an insurance agent. He had not only been living in New Orleans when Hurricane Betsy came through in 1965, but he had also just watched all the damage done by Hurricane Andrew in Florida just a few years earlier. So he told me, Sandy, pack for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he told me to pack. And I did. I had no reason to argue with him about that. So I had my checkbook. I even had some equipment to go work out if I had a chance to get some exercise. And I planned on living in a hotel for 3 weeks. Since the storm, I have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. To my knowledge, my family is the only family that evacuated for 3 weeks. Most everybody else packed for only a couple of days. And because I packed for 3 weeks, because I had my checkbook, because I had my laptop, because I had all the things that I need to be away from home for 3 weeks, that put me in a really unusual and relatively, I use the word relatively, secure spot compared to other people. And then I found out that my house didn't flood. So I had the luxury, if you want to call it, that I could, from a relatively secure spot, be reading everything that was happening, watching the television, and listening to the radio when most people were in total trauma, didn't have anything, all the things that they needed. And also they couldn't even get back into the city to get the things that they needed.
I thought your story of your neighbors was really interesting. Tell a little bit about that.
You must be referring to Mr. and Mrs. Prince, who live directly across the street from us.
I'm talking about the couple where they decided to go next door, and they had the dog.
Right. So that you're talking about Winnie and Harvey Miller, and they actually are not my neighbors. They actually live right by a levee breach. My neighborhood didn't flood, but their neighborhood definitely did flood, and they're lucky to be alive, and they know it. And they know they were lucky to be alive. But because they were given keys to a 2-story home across the street that they could evacuate to after the levee broke, they waded over there in knee-deep water and to move into the other home. And because of that, they would not have survived because Winnie couldn't swim. So it's
and that was his wife.
And you raised a good point. That's just one story. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds, there's thousands of stories, each more hair-raising than the next.
Well, this one, let's continue that story because it's so interesting. I mean, and I know we're going past the initial time, But what eventually happened to them was so interesting, and their dog.
Well, the three of them were separated. Winnie, because she had recently had a heart attack, so she got immediately ushered onto a bus because she was a very, very high risk person. And then Harvey couldn't go with his wife. And then meanwhile, he had his dog. And when he tried to get onto a bus, they wouldn't let him because his dog was with him. And the bus driver even offered to shoot the dog to put him out of his misery. Well, Harvey said, no, thank you. Please don't shoot my dog. And so he waited by the side of the road and trying to figure out what to do. And just by luck, one of the bus drivers recognized the dog, Monet, and he used to walk the dog, and he was now a bus driver for FEMA. And he told Harvey, what you need to do is the SPCA is here and you can give your dog to them. So they did take the dog. I don't know if the dog would have survived on its own. They took the dog. And so now the dog is separated from Harvey. So Winnie went one way, Harvey went another, and the dog went a third. And meanwhile, Harvey still had to wait until he could get on a bus. So this is the harrowing experience from one of the lucky people. These are people who are the lucky people. The experience of this trauma was so significant that Harvey was not himself for over a year. He would only speak when spoken to. He used to be a gregarious, outgoing professor. All of a sudden, he would only answer questions. This was utterly traumatic. A lot of people 17 years later still haven't recovered. But there is a silver lining here. Because of stories like Harvey and Winnie, who could not get on a bus because they had their dog with them, the federal government has changed the law and passed a law called PETS, Pets Evacuation Transportation Act, requiring states to accommodate for people's pets in the case of evacuation, not to protect the pet, to protect the owners, because many owners would not evacuate without their pet, and many owners, in the case of what happened in New Orleans, they stayed with their pets and perished with them. So there's always some good comes out of tragedy, and the passage of that law is one of the good things to have happened.
Well, I do remember in the book you saying that Monet was just screaming when Monet got separated from his owner. I mean, he was just crazed.
Can you imagine having to turn your back and walk away while your dog is screaming?
No.
But he'd done the best he could. He'd done the best he could for Monet.
What else could he do at that
What else could he do?
But the good thing I remember in the book is that they were reunited.
Yes. All three were reunited. It was a very stressful time, but they were reunited, I believe, 3 or 4 days later.
The other thing that I think was so important was that the 9th Ward, where a lot of people without a lot of means lived, and it was just almost wiped to the ground.
The difference between the folks of the lower 9th Ward and the folks of Harvey and Winnie's neighborhood is Harvey and Winnie neighborhood was near a drainage canal. It was big. It was a big canal with 5,000 cubic feet of water per second flows through that. And then the 17th Canal, about 10,000. The Inner Harbor Navigation Canal is so many, I don't even know what it is. It's a navigation canal. Big ships go through that canal. It's not just a drainage canal. So when the wall of the lower 9th Ward went, for the same reasons that all others went, but when the wall went, it was like Niagara Falls was unleashed onto the neighborhood. So the entire neighborhoods were just obliterated, just washed off the foundations and disappearing into nothing. And if one were to travel to the lower 9th Ward now, you would see the extent of the devastation, blocks and blocks of nothingness. It's still that way, near the breach.
I actually walked that area right after the hurricane, and I was amazed to see steps, for instance, going nowhere. Steps on the, on the yard around it, steps up to the house, but no house.
Mhm. A very common sight in the lower Ninth Ward, again, because of the size of that particular breach and how much water flowed through that breach. Although the mechanism for the breach, why it failed, was the same as for the other breaches that I just spoke of.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
I was fascinated by your book where it said in your research, what you found that the construction of the levees was the responsibility of the Army Corps of Engineers. And you found that the Corps of Engineers, to save money, made a decision based on missed information during a test or study that they had, was that the primary cause of the levees was not holding the water back. So tell us about that whole thing.
Certainly. More than 5 years after the levee breach event, I was preparing a nomination. I was nominating the breach site to the National Register of Historic Places. And in the process of my research, I was forced to read all of the reports. It was necessary to read all the reports. And I discovered deep in a report, a 333-page report, information that the Army Corps of Engineers was in 1982. Let me back up just a little bit. It turned out that 17 years after Hurricane Betsy, the Army Corps of Engineers still had not finished building the flood protection system. And in 1982, the Government Accountability Office essentially took the Corps out to the woodshed and said, you are behind schedule, get to work, stop with the excuses and finish the job. So the Army Corps of Engineers, it's now 17 years since Hurricane Betsy, they haven't even started yet. And meanwhile, costs are rising. So the Army Corps of Engineers, there's no problem with this. I don't have a problem with this, but they decided to look for ways to save money since costs were rising. And they wanted to look for ways to save money on steel. Steel's very expensive, and it's very expensive to drive it into the ground. So they did a huge test in the Atchafalaya Basin and determined when it was all over, when the study was done, that they only needed to drive steel sheet pilings into the ground 16 feet, because any more of that would be a waste of steel, which is expensive. So it's 16 instead of 46. Originally, it was 46. So the Army Corps of Engineers issued new guidelines for all of their people and said, from now on, these levees shall be built with steel sheet pilings just 16 feet into the ground. Again, I found this piece of information buried deep in a report. It was not in the executive summary. It was not common knowledge. And I didn't find out about this until we're talking 2011, 2012. Okay. So that was the information that we're talking about. And eventually that information found its way into this report that was published in 2015. So this is out there now, but it wasn't out there at the time. Why? I'd love to know. I don't know if, I mean, in my nightmares, I think somebody took it out and didn't want that to be in the executive summary, or maybe it was missed. Who knows? But that is the reason. And this was not well-known knowledge in the immediate days, weeks, and months after the levees breached. No, it would take years for that information to come out. I read that report in 2011. That's when I read the whole report. That report came out in 2008. So the moral of the story, Nan, is don't stop at the executive summary, read the report.
Yeah, definitely. And I think they saved like $100 million or something like that. But
that's correct. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money, but think of the lives and,
yes,
obviously,
this would be an important time to mention it was a mistake. It was not intentional. It was a mistake. And I don't think there's anyone who will disagree with that.
Well, the mistake, if I remember right, was because that part of the test where the steel was covered up with a tarp or something. Wasn't that
right?
True?
That's correct. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see that when water seeped behind, this is technical engineering, but when water seeped down the sheet piling, it separated. And then as soon as a little bit of water got in there, that was enough to make the whole thing fail. So how it got missed, why it got missed, but that's the story. And Yeah. But again, there is no evidence that there was any intentional harm done.
Malfeasance or something.
None.
Yeah. I think a lot of it can be that, as you know, every time you have a presidential change, you also have a total change in the department heads. And I guess when I'm saying department heads, the people that are appointed particularly. And it's possible, I suppose, that from one to another, it just simply didn't get transferred down. But it certainly was cause and effect that was really bad.
And there is no controversy here. In fact, as recently as a month ago, the Great Courses came out with a course called Engineering Disasters. It's a 26 lesson series on engineering disasters all over the country and all over the world. I think it's all over the world, although it might be in the US. And the most costly one of all is the one that occurred right here in New Orleans in 2005. And the Professor Stephen Wessler did a very, very good job of explaining the reason this happened is because of that failure that we just got finished describing, the eye wall failure, the steel sheet wall failure.
Wow.
So how it happened, why it happened, we could talk for a long time, but it did.
The other thing I found interesting is, though the Orleans Levee Board was responsible for the maintenance of the levees, not the construction, at the time it seemed like the board was blamed for the levees not holding back the water. And what were your findings on that?
You're absolutely right about that. So in the very, very early days, the Army Corps of Engineers refused to answer any questions until the studies were complete. So 9 months went by. That's a long time. And meanwhile, the people of the nation want answers. Nobody wants to wait for answers. And during this time, the business community, just 7 weeks after the flooding, just 7 weeks, you realize 7 weeks might as well have been 7 minutes. This was a huge disaster. There were lots of breaches. It was all of the people doing the investigations had barely even got their boots on the ground yet. The investigations wouldn't be complete for years, but 7 weeks after the flood, the business community had made up their mind who was responsible. It's the Orleans Levee Board for not paying attention to the levees, which didn't make any sense. I mean, here I was, I'm not even an engineer, but in my mind, if a brand new building fell to the ground, those levees that broke were only 5 years old. Okay. If a brand new building fell to the ground, you wouldn't blame the janitor. You'd look to the architect, the engineer, and the architect, the engineer, and the leaving somebody out. Architect, engineer, I'm leaving one out, but I'll think of it in a minute. But in the case of the levees, the Army Corps of Engineers is all three. Yeah, the contractor. The contractor, the architect, and the engineer. The Army Corps is all three, and so it didn't make sense that this could be the fault of the Orleans Levee Board. But keep in mind, I was in an unusual space. I didn't flood. I had everything I needed, and everyone else is traumatized. Everybody else had to deal with FEMA, the contractor, and the insurance company, and didn't have time to be paying attention to the business community talking about the Orleans Levee Board being at fault. Meanwhile, the Levee Board really didn't have the resources to defend itself. So with a lot of attention was paid to the Orleans Levee Board, and I prefer to call it the Great Distraction, because the people who were responsible was the federal government, was the Army Corps of Engineers, but it would be years before this information came out.
Well, in those situations, sometimes I think somebody has to be the goat. Somebody has to be the scapegoat. Mm-hmm. And once that person is picked, especially if they are maligned by high-powered individuals, a lot of it becomes supposition becomes fact. In
many ways, I can't blame the people of this country for having trouble believing it could be the great and powerful Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, they were the experts. They were the gold standard. These were the people that had built tens of thousands of miles of levees along the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio River, capable of withholding 20 feet of water or more every year for 30 days or more. And these levees that broke in Hurricane Katrina were drainage canals, were mostly drainage canals. They were only supposed to hold water for a few hours at most, and not every single year. So I can understand why people had difficulty believing that the federal government could have messed up as badly as it did. But here we are.
Well, as a citizen, you felt that the truth was really not getting out, and you decided to take action. Tell us what you did.
Well, the first thing I did was I was naive. Boy, when I thought, imagine how naive I was that I thought that me, with no special training, not even an engineer, no special education, could educate the entire country on what the real reason for the flooding. But I was that naive, and I was that invested in it because I'd watched my entire city go underwater. I mean, actual people that I know drowned in the flooding. So I had basically unprecedented moral authority, to hold on to this and to keep holding on to it until I feel we got somewhere. But I couldn't have done it without my 15-year-old son, Stanford. He had just turned 15, and he said, "Mom, if you come up with a mission, I'll do a website." And he created the website. I created the mission. The goal is to educate the country about why New Orleans flooded. And then I thought we needed one more thing: members. We need to have members in our little ragtag organization. And to do that, keep in mind, this is 2005. We didn't have social media. We didn't have YouTube yet. I just put up this little website that's still available online if you go to the Wayback Machine, and just put up a petition to President Bush asking him to please keep his promise and build back the flood protection system bigger and better than it was, and ask people to sign it. And overnight, we got 200 people. So that's how we started.
You were probably shocked, weren't you?
I was, but we had some pretty engaged people a couple of months after the flood. I mean, these are people who had nothing, people living in hotel rooms, living with their relatives. 2/3 of the people that signed that petition were out of town. 2/3 of my database to this day is people who no longer live in New Orleans.
I shared with you that I was a little bit aware of all of this because Guy Rankin from Houston Housing Authority contacted me to work with him in consulting and put together a whole system to handle, maybe call them the refugees or people that were displaced by the flood. And he was in Houston. I remember at that time it was so new and so different on that scale that there were no forms, there were no contracts, there were no any of these things that you normally would have. And we had to develop all of those things. And Guy really did a great job pulling it all together. And I remember interviewing people in order to get them the rental assistance and get them into in a rental situation with an owner. And I remember a lot of those people were just so traumatized. And I wondered afterwards, how many of those people ever went back? Are there any statistics, particularly about those that were displaced to other full cities? Did they ever, what percent ever went back?
These are very, very good questions. And there are books on this subject of the diaspora and how an entire city was displaced. We still do not have our full population back, especially in Eastern New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward. A lot of people, all of their investments was in their home.
Yeah.
And when they lost their home, they couldn't move back, for many people, especially the elderly. So the city, of course, the people who like to bring the people who want people to move back to New Orleans. They don't like to talk about how the people haven't been able to come home yet. But I can promise you, so many people moved away and could never come home because they couldn't, they just didn't have the financial wherewithal to do that. Keep in mind, in New Orleans, like most places in the country, families live near each other. You know, sisters live near sisters and live near their brothers. They live near their mothers. Well, if your neighborhood flooded, all of your family flooded too. You couldn't just move in with your sister or your mother. So the whole families, extended families, ended up not only moving out of the city, but not necessarily together. Not necessarily together.
I remember that they had said that houses were deeded down to families over many, many years, and that's why they had not really bought that new house from someone else. It was deeded down within the family.
You're talking about the historic Lower Ninth Ward.
I am.
That was often the case.
Yes, I am.
That's not all of the city of New Orleans, but that's certainly the case in the historic Lower Ninth Ward. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And that contributed to the difficulty as well.
And maybe that's contributed to people not going back or not being able to go back. I don't know.
I would agree that the answer is yes. I wish I knew more about that, but you raise a very, very good point. And again, there are whole books and courses devoted to that issue, the diaspora that happens when you have a disaster of this scale. And we don't call it a disaster, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. How well do you think New Orleans is protected from flooding at this point?
We have a much better system than we did when Hurricane Katrina storm surge arrived 17 years ago. I mean, the main problem with water was allowed to get into the heart of the city through those drainage canals that I mentioned. So all of those drainage canals now have gates at the mouths of them and pumps so that when they're shut, water can still be pumped out even when they're shut. Nothing like that was proposed prior to Katrina. We didn't have anything like that. And also east of the city, a gigantic storm surge barrier was built to stop surge from coming in through the Gulf and getting into that giant navigation canal that I talked about. And that's where the Lower Ninth Ward flooded, and other changes as well. So between all of these changes that were made, look at it this way. When Hurricane Ida came a year ago, almost a little more than a year ago, I evacuated because I needed to have perfect internet the next day, but I offered to have my son stay here in my house because we had a safe house here. We had a battery operated AC with connected to the what do you call the things on the roof? That connect the sun, that connects the sun, solar panels. Solar panels. Okay. And you can live indefinitely with the AC off of these solar panels with this new system that we have. So he stayed here and I was that confident that the system would hold up. The mayor was confident enough that she didn't call an evacuation. We have a much better system now. I am confident about that.
Well, that is good. So tell me what your organization, levees.org, is working on now.
I'd love to get to that, but there was, I want to share with you, you wanted to know how was I able, my little ragtag bunch of people, how were we able to educate the whole nation? And we did.
Ragtag, I honestly didn't.
Yeah, no, that's a fine name for it. We were a bunch of ragtag. I mean, none of us were experts. We're all experts in different ways, but we were ragtag, and that we had an engineer, and we had an attorney, and we had an artist, and we had a web designer, and we had all these people come together with different skills, and we got together. And the reason we were successful, even though we were up against the great and powerful Army Corps of Engineers that put a lot of money to shut us down. They spent a lot of money harassing us and trying to stop us, which is all in my book. The reason we prevailed is because for us, this isn't a paycheck. I mean, the people that the Army Corps of Engineers was paying to shut down my group, they punch a time clock and they go home at night and they go back to their families. The people of New Orleans that were a member of my group, we have no time clock. We are always at work. 365 days a year. And we didn't give up. And we're still working. And that's the reason that we prevailed. And that's the reason that I have a podcast called Beat the Big Guys, because inside every single person in this country, if you see a problem in your community, you have the power within yourself to fix it, just as I had the power to lead an organization to fix it.
I think that grassroots philosophy is so important, including today. It's really important.
Every bit is important, and we have more tools now. And we didn't have the social media tools, so now we have even more tools. But in answer to your question, what are we working on now? We're working on two things. After the flooding of New Orleans, most of the houses, or almost all of them, were put back into commerce. But there was one house right by the breach of the London Avenue Canal, very near where Harvey and Winnie lived, but on the other side. And not the other side of the canal. That canal actually broke on both sides. So that's a testament to how weak those walls were. But there was a house on the other side. It didn't get carried off its foundations and pushed into the street like the one next door. This one survived. So my organization bought that house, and we're working on getting that house placed on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic monument. So we're working on that right now. And the other thing my organization's working on is, would you believe that engineering students are not being taught about engineering failures and what lessons that can be learned from them? They're not. They're not. In this country, there is not a rule is the wrong word, but there is no standard where all engineering students need to be taught about bad engineering failures and why they need to learn from them, and what the lessons that can be learned from them. And that's another thing that my organization is behind right now. And we are looking to the 20th anniversary to announce that we're getting that done, which is still 2.5 years away.
So tell us a little bit more about your book.
Well, I didn't want to write a book. I'll be honest, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. But one of my trusted advisors called me in 2013 and said, "Sandy, you need to write a book." He said, "No one can write it for you. You need to write a book about your experience and why you did this and how you did it, and et cetera." And my response to him was, I know I should. And I said, okay. And it's only because I trust him so much. He has given me such good advice over the years. He's a media advisor, that I said, okay. And I got to work. It took me 5 years to write that book, because I was also doing the business of levees.org while I was writing. So I started in 2013. I finished it in 2018. And found a publisher in 2019. And lucky me, my book came out right when the pandemic started. But
well, you had a lot of research in the book, because there's a lot of footnotes and a lot of ties into factual information. And so that probably took a while too, to just get that research.
Yeah. The original manuscript had 1,000 footnotes, 996 to be exact.
Wow. Now your son must, have graduated from college at this point?
My son? Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed. He's 31 years old now.
Oh my
and he went to Washington University in St. Louis. And he's one of those there's a genre of engineers of software engineers that they don't graduate. They only go for 3 years and then they get a job. And it's almost a badge of honor to not graduate from college if you're a software engineer, like Steve Jobs didn't graduate from college. So he's one of those.
So what's interesting to me is that all those years ago that you depended on him when you were doing the website and all the technology for levees.org, and that he actually did turn out to be a software engineer.
Yeah.
That's so much fun to read your book and read those things and think, okay, so what's the end of that story? That was great.
Yeah. So in fact, I'll see him tonight for dinner.
Well, tell him hello from somebody who read the book.
I will.
Tell me, what are a couple of takeaways that you'd like us to get from what you've done and what you see in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking me that. Again, I touched on this just a little bit, but if you see a problem in your town or community, trust me, you have the power to change it. And all you have to do is believe in yourself. In my podcast, it's a weekly podcast. Every week I interview somebody different who has taken on the big guys in some form or fashion in their own neighborhood. It could be an oil company. It could be the police establishment, but they have taken on the big guys and won. And there's a connecting theme that I noticed through every single one is for all of them, the big guys that you're trying to beat will try to avoid the subject. They'll try to change the subject. They'll avoid the issue. They will do literally anything to avoid the subject, including going after you who trying to make the world a better place. And all you have to do is recognize that they're doing that and don't let them. Don't let them change the subject. Don't let them avoid the issue. Don't let them. And it's not that hard. You could just be nice about it and say, thank you for discussing the weather and the price of tea in China. Now, can we please get back to the issue and just be nice about it? Hold your ground and recognize what's going on. And if they ever try to disparage you or do a character assassination of you, that's a compliment. It means they can't stand on the facts. So they're going to go after you. It's a compliment. Take it as such and move on.
I kind of visualize you in your Wonder Woman outfit, like David standing up to Goliath.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
I think that's kind of nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's been so much fun talking with you and so enlightening in so many ways, especially in the whole citizens action area. And I just wondered if there's anything else that you'd like to add to it.
I think we really covered everything. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity, to help people help themselves. No matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys. I mean, I figure if I can do it, with no special training, no special education, and come up against the Army Corps of Engineers, I think really that anyone can do anything.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Nan. Nice talking with you.